That some want to invoke the Constitution's 25th Amendment to remove the president.
Now, that was ratified back in 1967, but has never been used in a case like this. For it to happen, a lot of people in Washington would have to agree that President Trump is mentally unfit to serve.
It's one of the checks and balances built into the Constitution, the 25th Amendment, an orderly way to remove a president if he or she is deemed unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office. In this case, the argument is being made that Trump's role in yesterday's Capitol insurrection shows he's mentally unfit to serve.
It's time to invoke the 25th Amendment and to end this nightmare.
It's an argument some Republican lawmakers and governors are now making, along with nearly 100 Democratic congressmen and senators, and the nation's largest manufacturing organization. And according to multiple reports, Trump's own cabinet members have already started discussing it. So how does it work? Well, first, Vice President Pence and a majority of the 15-member cabinet would have to declare the president unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. At that point, the president can react. If he refutes the assessment as expected, the cabinet and vice president would have to make their case to Congress. To remove the president and put Mike Pence in power would take a two-thirds majority in both the House and the Senate. And since Congress has 3 weeks to vote, it could be a moot issue, considering that Trump only has 13 days left in office.